Now that we've created a global reset for our CSS, let's get into styling some basic elements inside of our design so that we can get it to look closer to what we have in our layout. To begin with, let's start with our body. First thing I want you to do, if you don't already have Reset HTML open, be sure to open that. Again, it's inside the Chapter 5 folder that we've been working with for the past few videos. So once you have the reset.html open, go to your CSS styles. And right after the one that we've just introduced, let's now add a new CSS rule, and this one is going to be dealing with the body tag. Since the body tag comes up pretty high on the HTML order, we'll try to address it first. So we'll come in here and say body. Make sure this is in the appropriate CSS file. You could use this one, or if you're still working with the My Styles, you can continue working with that as well. I'll click OK. And the only thing we want to do with the body is just sort of set out a few definitions. First of all, I want to give my body a background color. So I'll come in here and we'll say something like this dark gray. 333 should be just perfect. Couple of other things. Now, we're going to get into the typography in all of our work a lot more in depth in the next chapter. But until we do so, let's just set some very basic elements in play. We'll set Arial Helvetica Sans Serif. I'll also set the font size to 100%. Now, the line height we had mentioned previously in the reset that we had been setting that to a line height of 1.5 ems. I oftentimes like to do that here in the body as well. Now that should be fine for us to work with, and I'm going to click OK. At this moment, you'll see all of your elements in place the way we had discussed earlier. The only difference being is that the background is a different color. Now, one last thing, you'll notice the size of our H1 header is rather small, and that's because if you go to this reset CSS that we had here, we had actually introduced a font size of 100 in the limited reset. I'm actually going to remove it from our limited reset. Same thing with the line height of 1.5 em. And the reason being is because I'm just setting that as we had just done on the body. So if we press Command S or Control S on the PC, then click here, you should see your header is going to be a little bit bigger. Remember, this is not really a major issue for me at this point because we're going to be setting all of the typography styles a little bit later on. The next thing I want to do is to define how the containing element, remember, I'm selecting it here right at this point in my design view, and you'll notice in the code view it's wrapping around this div with the ID called wrapper. Now the wrapper is holding everything in place. So let's do something to make it look somewhat better than it does at the moment. We'll come to our CSS styles, click on New CSS Rule, and this time we're going to be applying it to an ID called wrapper. So if you don't have this already defined, choose the contextual selector type as ID and hashmark wrapper. That's the one that we're targeting at the moment. So with the wrapper, there's a couple of things that I want to do as well. First of all, we'll come to the background and let's just give it a specific value. I'm going to ask you to type in, let's see, I could come in here, it's kind of a grayish color that I'm looking for, but let's try this. We'll say CD, CD, CD. That's going to give you sort of a lighter gray. When you apply it, you can see that the containing element that's holding all of our information is now a lighter color than the background. A couple other things. We want to make sure that this wrapper is always going to be aligned in the center of our page. So we'll define some properties that it needs to work with. For example, 960 pixels will be defined for its width. I'll leave the height alone for a second because we're going to let the content define how big this particular wrapper is going to be. But there's a couple of other things that I want to deal with. In order to get it to be centered on the page, there's two things we need to do. First of all, we're going to determine what the margin is. So to center it, as we've seen in a previous video, we set the right and left margin to a value of auto. Now you could also just let the wrapper touch the top of your browser window, but if you don't want it to do that, you can also give it a little margin on the top. Let's say hypothetically 20 pixels and 20 pixels on the bottom, and that will just push it away from its edge on the top and on the bottom if and when it does touch the bottom. So at this point, the last thing we need to do to get it to center on the page is to go to the positioning area and set the positioning to relative to where it's supposed to be right now. Calculate the width and the size of the browser, and then automatically distribute whatever's left over on the right and left hand side. You might remember this will get it to center on the page. If you switch to your design view, I don't really have a lot of space available here, so you might not be able to see it. Even in live view, it doesn't really show up all that much. So I'm going to preview this in my browser. We'll save the HTML file and the CSS file, and let's take a look. If I stretch this out larger or smaller, you'll notice that it is always centered on the page. You'll notice it's also 20 pixels away from the top of this page. Good. So we've got that in place, and we're ready to move to the next element that I want to talk about. And that's going to be discussing how the header and the nav sections are going to work.